66 million years ago, something happened. Not slowly, not gradually, not over millennia of shifting climate or creeping ice ages. It happened in a single afternoon. A rock, roughly the size of a small city, travelling at around 43,000 miles per hour, punched through Earth's atmosphere so fast that the air itself couldn't get out of the way. The compression alone generated heat hotter than the surface of the sun, and then impact. What followed was the worst day in the history of complex life on this planet. Wildfires swept across continents within hours. A shockwave circled the globe. The sky rained molten glass. And then, for months, perhaps years, the sun disappeared behind a shroud of debris and soot so thick that photosynthesis nearly stopped altogether. 3 out of every 4 species on Earth vanished. Gone. The dinosaurs, the pterosaurs, the great marine reptiles, the ammonites, all of them. Erased with a swiftness that the fossil record can only hint at. And yet, here is the thing that I keep coming back to, the detail that makes this story stranger and more wonderful than almost anything else in natural history. The dinosaurs didn't disappear. Not completely. Right now, as you listen to this, outside your window or perched in a tree or riding a thermal above some distant forest, a dinosaur is alive, breathing, moving through the world with the same ancient bones, the same feathered architecture, the same hollow-boned lightness that evolution shaped over 230 million years. We call them birds, but tonight let's take the longer view. Let's go back. All the way back to the beginning of the dinosaur story, and then follow it, quietly, carefully, through the fire and the darkness and the slow rebuilding of the world, all the way to the sparrow on your windowsill. This is the story of the greatest survival in Earth's history. Get comfortable, let your breathing slow, and let's begin. If you enjoy listening to sleepy prehistoric dinosaur stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly. To understand what was lost and what survived, we first have to understand what dinosaurs actually were, because the word itself carries so much weight, so much cultural baggage. We hear dinosaur, and we see the Tyrannosaurus of films, or the long-necked Brachiosaurus silhouetted against a tropical sky, or the Velociraptor of childhood nightmares. But the real story is so much richer than that. Dinosaurs didn't begin as the dominant creatures on Earth. They earned that position slowly, through a combination of evolutionary innovation, geological luck, and sheer biological persistence that lasted in total for about 165 million years. To put that in perspective, our own genus, Homo, has existed for perhaps 2.5 million years. The dinosaurs had been walking this earth for 66 times as long before a single human ancestor ever drew breath. The earliest dinosaurs appeared during the Triassic period, roughly 230 million years ago. The world then looked nothing like the one we know. The continents were all fused into a single supercontinent, Pangaea, a vast landmass surrounded by a single, enormous ocean called Panthalassa. The climate was hot, dry, brutally arid across vast interior regions. The plant life was dominated by ferns, cycads, and early conifers, dense, prickly, ancient-looking things that gave the landscape a strange, almost alien quality. And into this world the earliest dinosaurs appeared, small, upright, bipedal animals that moved differently from most of their contemporaries. Where other reptiles sprawled low to the ground, the early dinosaurs stood with their legs tucked directly beneath their bodies. This posture gave them a significant advantage: more efficient locomotion, better endurance, the ability to breathe while running. Think of it this way. Most reptiles move like someone doing a very awkward push-up. Elbows out, belly close to the ground, each step requiring a tremendous expenditure of energy. The early dinosaurs, by contrast, moved more like mammals and later more like us. Upright, efficient, surprisingly quick. One of the earliest known dinosaurs, Eoraptor, was barely the size of a Labrador retriever. A small, lightly built creature that scurried through Triassic underbrush, eating whatever it could find. Insects, small lizards, perhaps the occasional plant. Not exactly the stuff of legend. And yet, from this modest beginning, something extraordinary was about to unfold. At the very end of the Triassic period, about 201 million years ago, another mass extinction event struck. The precise cause is still debated among scientists. massive volcanic eruptions stretching across what is now the Central Atlantic magmatic province, pumped enormous quantities of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Global temperatures rose, ocean chemistry shifted, and perhaps 76% of all species on Earth perished. The dinosaurs survived. More than survived, they flourished. With so many of their ecological competitors wiped out, the early dinosaurs found themselves in a world of open niches, empty habitats, abundant resources with few rivals to contest them. What followed was one of the most extraordinary evolutionary radiations in Earth's history. The dinosaurs diversified at a rate that still amazes paleontologists who study the fossil record. Within a few million years, a geological eye blink, they had spread across the globe, exploiting every available habitat, evolving into forms of breathtaking variety. The long-necked sauropods grew to lengths that strain belief. Animals like Argentinosaurus may have reached 115 feet from nose to tail and weighed as much as 80 tons. To picture that weight, imagine 14 bull African elephants stacked together. And yet, these animals moved through their world with a kind of majestic slowness, browsing high in the canopy with necks that rose like living cranes above the treetops. The theropods, the two-legged carnivores, evolved in equally spectacular directions. The largest predators that ever walked on land belonged to this group. Spinosaurus, now believed to have exceeded the Tyrannosaurus in length, haunted the river systems of North Africa, hunting fish in the warm, shallow waters with a skull shaped something like a modern crocodile's. It may have been semi-aquatic, wading through ancient deltas in a world of mangrove forests and enormous coelacanths. And then there was Tyrannosaurus rex itself, saved, perhaps for last by evolution, appearing only in the final few million years of the Cretaceous period, as if the planet had taken 160 million years to perfect the design. The T-Rex was more than just large. It was in many ways a biological marvel. Its bite force, estimated at around 8,000 pounds of pressure, was the most powerful of any terrestrial animal ever measured or modelled. Its olfactory system was extraordinarily developed. Proportionally, the parts of its brain dedicated to smell were massive, suggesting it could detect a carcass from miles away on the right wind. Its vision, contrary to the famous movie suggestion that it relied primarily on movement, was actually acute. Forward-facing eyes gave it binocular vision and exceptional depth perception. The kind of visual system you see in apex predators, in hawks and owls, in creatures whose survival depends on precise targeting. And recent fossil evidence suggests it may have had lips, actual lips, covering those famous teeth, giving its face a more closed, almost contemplative expression when at rest. Which, I have to say, changes the mental image considerably. But the theropods weren't only defined by their largest and most terrifying members. There was another lineage within this group, smaller, faster, feathered, that was quietly doing something remarkable in the Jurassic forests and undergrowth. They were becoming birds. But we'll come to that. For now, let the image settle. A world of giants, of forests so vast they stretched across entire continents, of rivers the size of modern seas, of a sky filled with pterosaurs with wingspans that occasionally exceeded those of a small aircraft. This was the Mesozoic era, the age of the dinosaurs, and it lasted in one form or another for 165 million years, and then came the rock. Before we get to the impact, before we follow the story into the fire and the long winter, I want to pause here, because there is a thread running through the dinosaur story that most people miss entirely, a quiet, persistent, almost invisible narrative that was unfolding alongside all the drama of the great giants. It is the story of feathers. For most of modern history, we imagine dinosaurs as essentially scaled creatures, enormous reptiles, cold and dry and lizard-like in their textures. The great reconstructions of the 19th and early 20th centuries gave them smooth, leathery hides in shades of grey and green, and this image became so deeply embedded in popular culture that it feels almost wrong to challenge it. But the fossil record has been quietly, patiently, dismantling that picture for decades. The first hint came in 1861, just 2 years after Darwin published On the Origin of Species, with the discovery of Archaeopteryx in the limestone quarries of Solnhofen, Germany. It was, to put it simply, an astonishing animal. About the size of a modern crow, it had the bones and teeth and long bony tail of a small theropod dinosaur. but pressed into the fine-grained limestone preserved with extraordinary fidelity were the unmistakable impressions of feathers. Full, asymmetric flight feathers, the kind you find on a modern bird's wing. The scientific world didn't quite know what to make of it. Some saw it as proof of Darwinian evolution, a transitional form between reptiles and birds. Others argued it was simply a bird, nothing more. The debate simmered for over a century, and then, in the 1990s, the floodgates opened. From the fossil-rich beds of Liaoning province in northeastern China came an avalanche of feathered dinosaurs that transformed the field almost overnight. Sinosauropteryx, a small compsognathid dinosaur, was found in 1996 with clear evidence of simple filamentous feathers covering its body. Not flight feathers, not quills, but a fine insulating coat of what appeared to be early proto-feathers, giving the animal something almost fluffy in appearance. And then more. Caudipteryx, Microraptor, Anchiornis, Yichi, a bizarre creature with bat-like membranous wings supported by a strange wrist bone, unlike anything seen in other dinosaurs. The picture that emerged was extraordinary. Feathers, it turned out, were not an invention of birds. They were a dinosaur innovation, appearing first, most likely in the broader group of theropods, and perhaps even more widely distributed across the dinosaur family tree than that. Feathers evolved long before flight. They served first as insulation, perhaps as display structures, the evolutionary equivalent of a peacock's tail, evolved for attraction and intimidation before they were ever used for anything airborne. We now believe that many of the most famous dinosaurs, the theropods in particular, were at least partially feathered. The velociraptors of the late Cretaceous almost certainly had feather quills along their arms, and possibly their bodies. Yutyrannus huali, a relative of Tyrannosaurus from earlier in the Cretaceous, was enormous, perhaps 30 feet long, and covered in a shaggy coat of filamentous feathers. Which raises a question that I find genuinely delightful to sit with. What colour were they? This is one of those areas where paleontology has made progress so remarkable it almost doesn't feel real. By analysing the microscopic structures of fossilised melanosomes, the cellular organelles that contain pigment, scientists have been able to reconstruct the coloration of some feathered dinosaurs with reasonable confidence. Sinosauropteryx had a reddish-brown body with alternating light and dark bands on its long tail, something like a modern raccoon. Anchiornis, a small feathered dinosaur from the Jurassic, had a body of black and white feathers and a striking red crest on its head, an appearance described by some researchers as resembling a particularly well-dressed woodpecker. Microraptor, with its four wings and iridescent plumage, may have shimmered blue-black in the Cretaceous sunlight, like a modern starling seen at the right angle. The ancient world, it turns out, was not the grey and green place we imagined. It was vivid, colourful, alive with display and beauty in ways that the bones alone could never have told us, and somewhere in these Cretaceous forests and undergrowth, the lineage that would become modern birds was quietly perfecting the art of flight. By the late Cretaceous, true birds had diversified into dozens of forms. Diving birds, tern-like creatures with teeth, small arboreal forms that flitted through ancient canopies. They shared their world with the non-avian dinosaurs, were present in the skies and in the undergrowth on the day everything changed. Most of them died, but not all. Let me take you there. It is late Cretaceous, the Maastrichtian age. The world is warmer than today. There are no polar ice caps, and forests of ancient conifers and early flowering plants stretch almost to the poles. The continents are in roughly familiar positions, though the shallow seaway that splits North America in two, the Western Interior Seaway, stretches from the Arctic Ocean to the Gulf of Mexico. North America is a landscape of floodplains and river deltas, thick with hadrosaurs moving in herds that may have numbered in the thousands. Triceratops crops at vegetation with its parrot-like beak. And in the shadows, Tyrannosaurus rex moves with measured patience. Then, on what appears to be an ordinary morning, a streak of light appears in the sky. The impactor, a carbonaceous chondrite asteroid, roughly 6 to 9 miles across, enters the atmosphere at a shallow angle above what is now the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico. At the moment of impact, it is travelling at approximately 43,000 miles per hour. The compression of air in front of it generates temperatures hotter than the surface of the Sun. The impact itself is almost beyond description. The energy released is estimated at roughly 72 teratons of TNT, about 1 billion times more powerful than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The rock doesn't just hit the Earth, it punches through the crust, vaporizing itself and millions of tons of carbonate rock, sending a column of superheated gas and debris exploding upward through the atmosphere and into space. Within minutes, debris re-enters the atmosphere across the globe. Molten droplets of rock rain down from the sky, their re-entry heating the upper atmosphere to temperatures that may have been sufficient to ignite vegetation across entire continents. Tsunamis hundreds of feet high radiate outward from the impact site, devastating coastlines thousands of miles away. And then the real killer settles in. The impact vaporized enormous quantities of sulfur-bearing rock, and the sulfur injected into the stratosphere formed sulfuric acid aerosols. These aerosols, along with immense quantities of soot from global wildfires and the dust thrown into the atmosphere, created a barrier to sunlight that would persist for months. Some models suggest years. Without sunlight, photosynthesis stops. Without photosynthesis, the plants die. Without the plants, the herbivores starve. Without the herbivores, the carnivores have nothing to hunt. The food web unravels, rung by rung, from the bottom up. The largest animals are almost by definition the most vulnerable. A Tyrannosaurus rex required an enormous caloric intake to maintain its massive body. When prey animals disappeared, it had no fallback. The great sauropods needed vast quantities of vegetation. When the vegetation failed, they failed with it. The non-avian dinosaurs in all their magnificent variety were not equipped for what came next. But some animals were. And this is where the story becomes genuinely extraordinary. The question that has fascinated paleontologists since the KPG extinction event was first understood is, why these and not those? What separates the losers from the survivors? And the answer, as far as we can tell, is a cluster of biological traits, a particular combination of characteristics that turned out to be, quite by accident, exactly right for surviving an apocalypse. Small body size. This is perhaps the most obvious factor. Smaller animals need fewer calories to survive. During a period of ecological collapse, when food sources have become scarce, when the web of life is thinning daily, a small body is a survival advantage of enormous significance. A shrew can survive on a few calories a day, a Tyrannosaurus could not. The birds that survived the extinction event were small. The mammals that survived were small. The survivors of the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary, almost universally, were compact, energetically efficient creatures, dietary flexibility. The animals that made it through were, almost universally, generalists, omnivores, creatures that could eat seeds when there were no insects, insects when there were no seeds, carrion when there was nothing else. The dietary specialists were devastated. Seeds, in particular, may have been a crucial lifeline. Seeds are remarkably durable. They can survive in soil for years, waiting for conditions to improve. In the immediate aftermath of the impact, when living plant material was desperately scarce, seeds in the ground provided a food source for small seed-eating birds and mammals. This may be one of the central reasons that seed-eating bird lineages were disproportionately represented among the survivors. And then there is the matter of what researchers call life history strategy. Animals that reproduce quickly, that reach sexual maturity fast, that produce many offspring, these are animals that can repopulate rapidly when conditions improve. They can absorb enormous losses and still maintain viable populations. The large dinosaurs were almost certainly slow reproducers. T-Rex females may not have reached full size until their late teens or early 20s. Even if a small number survived the immediate impacts of the extinction event, a population under that kind of reproductive constraint could not have recovered fast enough to avoid eventual collapse. But birds, modern-style birds, the avian dinosaurs, are different. They reach reproductive maturity relatively quickly. They produce eggs, which means the entire reproductive process is externalized and energetically efficient. And they were already small, already feathered, already capable of generating their own body heat in the cold that followed the impact. There is something almost unbearably poignant about this. The features that would save the birds, their small size, their warm blood, their feathers, their generalist diets, were features that evolved for other reasons entirely. Evolution doesn't plan ahead. It doesn't foresee catastrophe. The birds weren't ready for the impact because anything was preparing them for it. They were simply lucky that the characteristics evolution had given them happened to be the right ones for surviving what no living thing could have anticipated. The modern bird tree of life may have bottlenecked through a very small number of survivors. the sheer diversity of modern birds, more than 10,000 species today, may have radiated from perhaps just a handful of lineages, or even a single ancestral population that made it through the darkness. The ancestor of all modern birds was likely a small, ground-dwelling, seed-eating bird, compact, unspectacular, the kind of creature that, in a museum diorama of the late Cretaceous, you might not even notice. A small brown shape scratching at the ground while Triceratops loom in the background. And from this modest survivor, 10,000 species would eventually emerge. Let that unfold slowly in your mind as you rest. From a single small bird, scratching through the ash of an apocalypse, came the albatross and the hummingbird and the cassowary and the barn owl and the Atlantic puffin. From one survivor, an entire world of wings. A kind reminder to not forget to subscribe to keep the channel alive. The world that existed on the other side of the extinction was a strange and humbled place. Imagine walking through it, if such a thing were possible, in the immediate aftermath. The silence would be the first thing you noticed. The great herds of hadrosaurs are gone. The thunderous footfalls of the sauropods, absent. The calls of pterosaurs across the morning sky, silenced. The forests, or what remains of them, stand in ruin. Many trees reduced to charred trunks and fallen debris. But life, tenacious and resourceful, was already beginning the process of rebuilding. The first colonizers of the post-impact landscape were fungi. Not plants, not animals, fungi. In a world flooded with dead and dying organic material, the fungal decomposers had an extraordinary abundance of substrate to work with. The fossil record from the immediate aftermath of the KPG boundary shows a dramatic spike in fungal spores, a grim but ecologically essential explosion of decomposition. Ferns came next. There is something called the fern spike in the fossil record, a layer of ancient rock right at the KPG boundary that shows a sudden, dramatic increase in fern spores. Ferns are pioneer species. They colonize disturbed ground rapidly, tolerating poor soils and low light. They were among the first large plants to begin reclaiming the devastated landscape, and the animals that survived, the small mammals, the birds, the lizards, the crocodilians, the freshwater fish, the insects, began, cautiously, to expand into the emptied world. The bird lineage didn't simply wait out the recovery. It diversified into it. This is one of the central insights from recent genomic studies of modern birds. The Great Radiation, the evolutionary explosion that gave rise to all of today's bird diversity, happened very rapidly in the immediate aftermath of the extinction event. Not millions of years later, once the world had recovered, almost immediately. The birds were filling ecological vacancies almost as fast as those vacancies were created. In the early Paleogene, a world of birds emerged that looks, from our modern vantage point, quite extraordinary. Gastornis, sometimes called the terror bird of Europe, was a massive flightless bird that stood over 6 feet tall. For a long time, it was assumed to be a predator. Its enormous beak seemed designed for tearing flesh. But more recent analysis suggests it may actually have been a large herbivore using that powerful beak to crack open hard nuts and seeds. In South America, isolated from the rest of the world for most of the Paleogene, a group of large flightless predatory birds called Phorusrhacids, the terror birds, actually did fill the apex predator niche. The largest, Kelencan, stood nearly 10 feet tall and had a skull the size of a horse's head, with a hooked beak capable of striking with tremendous force. For millions of years, the terror birds were among the dominant predators of South America, a continent where large mammalian carnivores were absent for much of the era. It is a profound reversal of the familiar narrative. In the Cretaceous, small birds cowered in the undergrowth while dinosaurian giants dominated the world. In the early Paleogene, the birds themselves became the giants, filling the vacated roles with their own evolutionary experiments. By perhaps 40 or 50 million years ago, the world was beginning to look, in broad strokes, somewhat familiar. Forests of flowering trees, grasslands, insects of staggering diversity, and birds in the canopy and birds in the undergrowth, birds wading in rivers and diving in the open ocean, birds hunting insects at night, and birds soaring on thermals above ancient mountain ranges. The ecological roles that had once been filled by an extraordinary variety of non-avian dinosaurs were now, in many cases, occupied by the survivors of the line. The dinosaurs hadn't gone. They had reorganized, miniaturized, refined, and they were still here. I want to spend some time with the giants, because I think we rush past them sometimes, rushing toward the extinction narrative, toward the survival story, without pausing to truly inhabit what their world was like. So let's slow down. Let's visit the Cretaceous. It is 75 million years ago. We're in what will one day be Montana, although there are no mountains here yet. The Rockies won't begin rising for another 10 million years. The land is low, warm, crisscrossed by river systems draining. Eastward into the western interior seaway, the air is thick and humid. Stand here. Breathe this air, warmer than the present, perhaps 10 degrees Celsius warmer on average. The oxygen levels were similar to today. The atmospheric carbon dioxide was significantly higher, perhaps 4 times present levels, driving that warmer, more lush world. And then the ground shakes, not dramatically, not like an earthquake, more like a very slow, very heavy footfall, a rhythmic, deep vibration that you feel more in your chest than hear with your ears. A herd of Edmontosaurus, the duck-billed hadrosaurs, is moving through the river floodplain perhaps half a mile away. There are dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Their calls carry across the water. They move in loose groups, the larger adults on the periphery, juveniles clustered in the centre of the herd. These are not the lumbering, dim reptiles of old reconstructions. Recent work on hadrosaur biomechanics suggests they were highly mobile, capable of moving bipedally when running and dropping to all fours when feeding. Their dental batteries, hundreds of teeth arranged in complex rows that ground vegetation with extraordinary efficiency, are among the most sophisticated dentitions in vertebrate history. The herding behaviour itself suggests social complexity. Living in groups, particularly groups where different age classes intermix, requires communication, coordination, the ability to recognise and maintain social relationships. Hadrosaurs likely communicated with a variety of vocalizations, postures, and possibly through colour. Their crests may have been brightly coloured structures used for species recognition and social signalling. Beyond the hadrosaur herd, partially obscured by a stand of ancient magnolia trees, a group of Triceratops feeds. These are among the most spectacular animals ever to walk the earth, their massive frill and 3 horns giving them an almost heraldic appearance. The frill, we now know from preserved specimens, was richly vascularized, filled with blood vessels that could flush it with colour, turning it from pale to vivid in seconds. Triceratops sparred with their horns, locking frills like 2 stags locking antlers, pushing and twisting in battles for dominance or mating rights. Fossilized frills bearing the damage patterns of these encounters connect us directly to individual moments in the Cretaceous, specific battles, specific animals, specific afternoons 66 million years ago. And then, at the edge of the forest, something large and deliberate emerges. Tyrannosaurus rex moves differently than the films suggest. It was not a particularly fast runner. Its massive body and proportionally short arms constrained its top speed, with estimates ranging from about 12 to 25 miles per hour. But speed was not its primary predatory strategy. T-Rex hunted more like a modern large predator, with patience, with stealth, with the ability to cover ground efficiently over long distances. Its footprint, oval depressions and Cretaceous mud, sometimes 4 feet long, tells us about its gait. The tracks show it walked with its feet directly beneath its body, bipedally, with a stride length that speaks of efficient, sustained locomotion. Not a sprinter, a patroller, a creature that covered its territory systematically, using its extraordinary sense of smell to locate prey at great distance before closing for the kill. Fossilized Triceratops bones have been found bearing the unmistakable marks of T-Rex teeth, sometimes with bone growth around the bite marks, evidence that the Triceratops survived at least that particular encounter. These 2 animals genuinely coexisted, genuinely interacted in the real world of the late Cretaceous. And above all of this, the pterosaurs rode the thermals. Quetzalcoatlus northropi had a wingspan approaching 35 feet. It stood as tall as a giraffe on the ground, though its hollow bones kept its weight to perhaps 500 pounds, the largest flying animal ever to exist. This is what we lost, not the lineage, but the scale, the sheer magnificent scale of that world is gone, and I think it is worth feeling that absence just for a moment before we return to the consolation of what survived. What survived is real and remarkable and present, but what was lost deserves to be mourned gently as you drift towards sleep. Let me bring you back to the present. If you were to look at a bird, any bird, A common sparrow scratching in the dirt, a crow tilting its head with one bright eye fixed on you, a heron standing motionless at the water's edge, and truly see it as what it is, the experience changes. What you are looking at is a theropod dinosaur, not descended from a theropod, not vaguely related to a theropod, not symbolically dinosaurian. A theropod dinosaur full stop, every bit as much as Velociraptor or Coelophysis or Spinosaurus. The features that define theropods, the hollow bones, the three-toed feet, the wishbone, the air sac, system that allows for unidirectional airflow through the lungs, all of these are present in modern birds. The bird you see at your feeder is, in the most literal biological sense, a feathered, flying, miniaturized theropod dinosaur. The respiratory system of birds is, in many ways, more sophisticated than our own. Birds breathe in a continuous unidirectional flow. Air passes through the lungs in one direction only, meaning the blood is always exposed to fresh oxygenated air. This is why birds can perform at altitude that would incapacitate a human. Bar-headed geese regularly migrate over the Himalayas, crossing at altitudes exceeding 23,000 feet, above the height at which most humans need supplemental oxygen. The brains of birds are also remarkable in ways that have only recently been fully appreciated. Modern neuroscience has revealed that the avian brain, while architecturally different from the mammalian brain, achieves comparable levels of cognitive sophistication through different structural arrangements. Crows and ravens are the most dramatic examples. These birds can use tools, plan for the future, recognize individual human faces, understand displacement, and even demonstrate something that looks very much like theory of mind. In one famous set of experiments, New Caledonian crows were presented with a series of problems requiring them to use one tool to retrieve another tool, which could then be used to retrieve food, a multi-step planning problem. They solved it. In another study, western scrub jays, which cache food for later retrieval, were shown to remember not just where they had cached food, but when. If a perishable food item had been cached long enough to have gone bad, the jays selectively avoided those cached locations and went to fresher caches instead. This is what researchers call episodic-like memory. But perhaps the most striking aspect of birds as living dinosaurs is something far simpler and more immediate: their song, bird. Vocalizations are produced by an organ unique to birds called the syrinx. Unlike the mammalian larynx, the syrinx is located deep in the chest, at the fork where the trachea divides into the two bronchial tubes. Some bird species have two independent syringeal halves, allowing them to produce two distinct sounds simultaneously, which is why some species can sing harmonies with themselves. The sedge warbler improvises its song from a repertoire of over 50 different phrase types, never repeating the same sequence twice. The brown thrasher is estimated to have more than 2,000 distinct song types. The nightingale can produce 1,000 different song types from its repertoire. Outside your window right now, a bird is doing something that no non-avian dinosaur could do. It is singing. And in that song, built from memory, from learning, from the accumulated cultural transmission of sound patterns passed from parent to offspring across generations, there is something that feels almost like history. Birds did not simply inherit a world, they helped build it. This is one of the most underappreciated aspects of avian natural history, the sheer extent to which the world as we know it has been shaped by hundreds of millions of years of bird behavior. The plants we see, the forests we walk through, the distribution of species across continents, all of it bears the mark of birds. Consider seed dispersal. A significant proportion of the world's flowering plant species depend on birds to disperse their seeds. The plants produce fleshy, nutritious fruits, berries, drupes, arils that are attractive to birds as food. The bird eats the fruit. The seed passes through the digestive system intact and is deposited at whatever location the bird happens to be when it defecates, sometimes miles from where the fruit was consumed. This is not a passive or coincidental relationship. The plants evolved their fruits specifically for birds. The colours, reds and blues and purples, all colours, that birds see well and many mammals do not, are signals aimed at avian senses. The nutritional profiles of bird-dispersed fruits are optimised for quick digestion and rapid seed passage. On islands where endemic bird species have gone extinct, you can still find the fruits those birds once dispersed. Large, brightly coloured fruits with no obvious modern disperser, waiting for a partner that no longer exists. These are called ghost fruits, evolutionary relics of relationships that were broken by extinction. Pollination is another story of profound coevolution. In tropical regions especially, many plants depend on birds for pollination, and this relationship has driven spectacular evolutionary convergence. The tubular flowers of hummingbird-pollinated plants are precisely shaped for hummingbird bills. The flowers produce nectar in quantities and concentrations calibrated for the energy needs of hovering birds. Hummingbirds themselves are in many ways the most extraordinary birds on Earth, not in terms of size or intelligence, but in terms of physiological specialization. Their hearts, at rest, beat over 1,000 times per minute. During hovering flight, they beat faster still. They consume roughly half their body weight in sugar daily. To survive a cold night, they can drop into torpor, a temporary hibernation-like state, reducing their metabolic rate to a tiny fraction of its normal level, then warming back up at dawn. Birds of prey exert an enormous top-down influence on ecosystems through their predatory behavior. Remove the raptors from an ecosystem, and the effects cascade. Rodent populations explode. Vegetation is overgrazed. The whole ecosystem shifts toward a different equilibrium. The world as we know it is in part a bird-built world. The forests that clean our air and store our carbon. The wildflowers in meadows. The grasslands of the savanna and the temperate plains. All bear the fingerprints of hundreds of millions of years of avian influence. The dinosaurs, through their avian descendants, never really left. They just changed how they shaped the world. Flight is one of evolution's most extraordinary achievements, and the birds, our surviving dinosaurs, have taken it to places that continue to astonish. Consider the bar-tailed godwit. This is a relatively modest-looking shorebird, brown and russet and somewhat stocky, the kind of bird you might walk past on a mudflat without giving it a second look. And yet, the bar-tailed godwit completes what is by distance the longest non-stop migratory flight of any animal on Earth. Each autumn, godwits breeding on the Arctic tundra of Alaska gather on the tidal flats and begin eating. Prodigiously, they can double their body weight in a matter of weeks, accumulating fat reserves that will fuel one of the most extraordinary journeys in the animal kingdom. Then, following a change in atmospheric conditions that provides favourable tailwinds, they launch themselves into the air and fly south, non-stop. Without landing, without eating, without sleeping in any conventional sense, they fly through the night and through the day and through another night for over 11,000 kilometres, crossing the Pacific Ocean from Alaska to New Zealand in roughly 8 to 9 days of continuous flight. To fuel this journey, they metabolize not just their fat reserves, but significant portions of their digestive organs and muscle tissue. They essentially digest parts of themselves to keep flying. Their intestines, liver and kidneys shrink dramatically before migration to reduce unnecessary weight. Once they land in New Zealand, these organs rebuild over the weeks that follow. The Arctic tern completes a round-trip migration between the Arctic and Antarctic, perhaps 50,000 miles per year, effectively seeing more annual daylight than any other creature on Earth, wintering in Antarctic summer after breeding in Arctic summer. In its lifetime, a single Arctic tern may travel the equivalent of 3 round trips to the moon. The common swift takes sustained flight to its logical extreme. Swifts are quite literally aerial animals. They feed in the air, drink in the air, mate in the air. Young swifts fledging for the first time in summer may not touch a solid surface again for 2 or 3 years, flying continuously, sleeping in brief micro-sleep episodes while airborne until they return to breed. Birds navigate by the stars, by the sun, using an internal clock to compensate for its movement across the sky. By the Earth's magnetic field, they have magnetite crystals in their beaks and possibly a quantum mechanism in their eyes that allows them to literally see the magnetic field as a visual overlay on their normal vision, by landmarks, by smell in some species. The Manx shearwater, a seabird of the North Atlantic, was the subject of a famous experiment in which a breeding bird was captured on its nest in Wales, transported by air to Boston, Massachusetts, and released. It returned to its nest in 12.5 days, having crossed 3,200 miles of open ocean it had never encountered before. It arrived before the letter announcing its release. Feathers, hollow bones, air sacs, magnetic sense, star maps, and the courage to launch yourself over open ocean toward a destination you've never seen. This is what the dinosaur lineage became. Breathe that in as you rest. I want to pause for a moment and think about how we know any of this. Because it is easy, when the numbers get large enough, 66 million years, 230 million years, for the mind to sort of glide over them without truly grasping what they mean. Human brains are not built for deep time. We are exquisitely calibrated for the scale of a human lifetime, perhaps a few generations. The Mesozoic is simply incomprehensible to our intuitive sense of time. But there is something beautiful about the methods we've developed to read those incomprehensible timescales. Something almost meditative about the careful, attentive work that goes into extracting the story of deep time from the evidence it leaves behind. Consider the stratigraphic column. When geologists study a cliff face or a road cut or a borehole, they see layers of rock stacked atop each other, each one representing a chapter in time. In any sequence of undisturbed sedimentary rock, the older layers are at the bottom and the younger layers are on top. You can read a cliff face like a book, very slowly. The KPG boundary, the layer of rock that marks the moment of the extinction event, is visible in outcrops around the world. It is typically a thin layer, sometimes just a centimetre or two thick, of clay dramatically enriched in iridium, an element rare in Earth's crust but relatively abundant in asteroids. Growth rings in dinosaur bone, similar to the annual rings in tree trunks, allow paleontologists to age individuals with remarkable precision. A cross-section of a T-Rex femur examined under polarized light reveals a series of rings that tell the story of that individual's life. Fast growth in youth, a period of explosive growth in adolescence, slowing growth in the later years. This is how we know that T-Rex grew fastest between the ages of perhaps 14 and 18, a period of nearly a pound of new growth per day in some individuals. Pathologies in bone, injuries, infections, tumours give us glimpses of individual lives and the hazards they contained. Healed fractures in T-Rex fibulae, bite wounds from other T-Rexes on skulls. These are not abstract scientific data points. They are records of specific animals, specific injuries, specific moments of pain and survival 66 million years ago. And modern genomic techniques have opened an entirely new window into the past. By comparing the DNA sequences of living species and applying molecular clock methods, researchers can reconstruct evolutionary family trees with remarkable precision. The great burst of avian diversification in the immediate aftermath of the KPG, extinction, is written into the genomes of every living bird. We carry the memory of the asteroid impact in our DNA. All of us, and the birds outside your window carry it in theirs. There is something strangely comforting in that thought. That time leaves traces, that even the most catastrophic events are recorded in stone and in the living code of organisms waiting to be read by those patient enough to look. The rocks remember everything. I want to go back to that transition moment one more time, the night after the impact, because it is one of the things I find most difficult to truly imagine, and yet most important to try. The immediate day of the impact was catastrophic beyond comprehension for those within a few thousand miles of the Yucatan. But what about the animals on the other side of the planet? In what is now Asia or Africa, what did the first night after the impact feel like? The answer, based on the models, is cold and dark. Not immediately on the first day. On the first day, there might have been an eerie reddening of the sky as the stratosphere filled with material. An unusual orange twilight that lasted longer than normal. But within days to weeks, as the sulfuric acid aerosols spread globally and the impact debris settled into the stratosphere, the sun would have dimmed. Progressively, measurably. Plants that depended on specific light levels for photosynthesis would have begun to struggle, and the temperature would have begun to drop. For the small, feathered, warm-blooded birds that survived into this period, the cold itself would have been manageable. Their feathers provided insulation. Their endothermy allowed them to maintain body temperature independently of ambient conditions. But the food was the problem. Imagine a small bird, let's call her the ancestor. She's perhaps the size of a modern sparrow. She has been roosting in a stand of ancient hardwoods, waiting out what seemed, in the first few nights after the impact, simply like bad weather. Unusual, unsettling, but not unprecedented. By the second week, the leaves on the trees are beginning to show stress. Not enough light is reaching them. The insects that pollinate the understory flowers have become sparse. Cold and darkened conditions suppress insect activity. Our ancestor scratches at the leaf litter and finds a seed. Small, hard, dense with stored energy. She cracks it with her bill and eats it. This is the moment. This single act, finding and eating a seed that has been lying dormant in the soil, a seed that requires no sunlight to remain viable, is, in a very real sense, one of the acts that saved the dinosaur lineage. The seed-eating ability that certain bird lineages had developed in the Cretaceous turned out to be, in the darkest moment in the history of life on Earth, a survival superpower. The seeds in the soil were a library of stored energy, laid down before the impact, waiting in the darkness. The birds that could access them had food when everything else was dying. Months passed. The darkness persisted. Most of the large dinosaurs, whatever scattered individuals may have survived the immediate catastrophe, starved. But the ancestor scratched on. She found mates. She laid eggs, externalized reproduction, energetically efficient, faster than live birth. Her offspring grew quickly, reaching reproductive maturity in a year, perhaps less. They spread, they diversified, as the darkness slowly lifted over months, then years, then decades, as the ferns returned and then the flowering plants and then the insects and then the fruits and flowers. The birds were already there, already diversifying, already filling the empty world. The dinosaurs survived the end of the Cretaceous one cold morning of scratching through ash and finding seeds at a time, for months and years, until the sun came back. That patience, that persistence, that willingness to scratch through the darkness for whatever can be found, it is, I think, one of the most moving stories in the history of life, and it ended with the world we live in now. You're lying down now. Your breathing has slowed, the day has receded. Somewhere in the darkness outside, an owl is hunting. Its asymmetric ears, one set higher than the other, giving it the ability to triangulate sound in 3 dimensions with extraordinary precision, are tracking the footsteps of a mouse beneath the leaf litter. The owl's feathers are the most acoustically silent in the bird world. The leading edge of its primary flight feathers bears a comb of tiny serrations that break up the turbulent airflow that normally creates the swooshing sound of wing beats. Flying owls are, to the animals they hunt, effectively silent. The owl is a dinosaur hunting in the dark, and the heron standing motionless at the water's edge at dawn is a dinosaur hunting in the light. Its patience is extraordinary. It can stand without visible movement for minutes at a time, waiting for a fish to move within, striking range. Then, with a speed that the eye can barely follow, it strikes. And the crow, walking along the street, turning over leaves with one foot to look for food beneath. The crow is displaying tool-use adjacent behaviors, problem-solving, social intelligence, the full array of cognitive capabilities that make corvids the most cognitively sophisticated birds on Earth. The crow recognizes your face. It remembers whether you were kind or threatening when it last encountered you. It may tell other crows about you. There are well-documented cases of crows in urban environments that learn to carry hard nuts to traffic intersections and place them in the path of vehicles, then retrieve the cracked nuts from the crosswalk during the pedestrian phase of the traffic light, waiting safely on the curb while cars did the cracking. This is what 66 million years of evolution, unconstrained by the previous dominance of the large non-avian forms, can produce. The ravens that play in mountain updrafts, tumbling through the air with apparent joy, the lyrebirds of Australia that can reproduce with perfect fidelity the sound of chainsaws, camera shutters, car alarms, and the calls of other birds they have heard. The bowerbirds that build elaborate decorated structures, not nests, but display arenas, decorating them with coloured objects arranged according to aesthetic principles that vary by species. The albatrosses that spend years at sea, rarely touching land, forming pair bonds that last decades, and performing elaborate, mutually choreographed dances when they reunite at the breeding colony. The emperor penguins that huddle through Antarctic winter, the males incubating eggs on their feet in temperatures that reach -40, rotating slowly through the huddle so that no individual remains on the cold outer edge for too long. A collective behaviour that no individual penguin plans, but that emerges from the combined response of thousands of individuals to cold. This is the dinosaur lineage, 66 million years after the asteroid. It did not simply survive, it became something new, something that the Cretaceous world, for all its grandeur, never contained. The albatross at sea, the penguin in the Antarctic winter, the crow at the traffic light, the owl in the dark, these are the inheritors, the unbroken thread. And outside your window, right now, in whatever darkness has gathered, some member of this 230 million year lineage is breathing, waiting, ready for the morning. One of the most remarkable facts about dinosaur paleontology today is how much of it is still being written. We are not in an era of mopping up, of filling in the last details of a basically complete picture. New dinosaur species are being formally described at a rate of roughly one per week. Somewhere in the world, every week, a new species name enters the scientific literature for the first time. Some of these come from famously productive fossil sites, the Gobi Desert, the Patagonian Badlands, the Hell Creek Formation of Montana and North and South Dakota. But others come from places that were simply never looked at before, or were looked at with cruder tools and less experienced eyes. The Sahara Desert, which might seem an unlikely hunting ground for fossils, has yielded extraordinary discoveries. Expeditions into the Moroccan and Niger Sahara in the 1990s and 2000s produced an astonishing array of species new to science. Nigersaurus, a sauropod with a strangely wide vacuum cleaner-like mouth bearing hundreds of tiny teeth in a single row, was apparently a low-level browser that cropped vegetation from ground level like a prehistoric lawnmower. China has become perhaps the most productive dinosaur-producing country in the world. The Yixian Formation of Liaoning Province, the same beds that yielded the explosion of feathered dinosaurs in the 1990s, continues to produce extraordinary finds. But other Chinese formations in Xinjiang, Yunnan, Shandong, and elsewhere have added dozens of species across a range of geological periods. Argentina has produced the largest dinosaurs known to science. Patagotitan majorum, described formally in 2017, may be the most massive land animal ever to have existed. Estimated to have weighed around 70 tons, it was discovered by a rancher who spotted a giant bone protruding from the ground. The subsequent excavation uncovered 223 bones from at least 6 individuals. When the bones were assembled for display at the American Museum of Natural History in New York, the animal was so large that its neck extended out of the dinosaur hall into the elevator lobby. These animals were not simply big, they were pushing against the limits of what biology allows on land. The challenges of being that large, moving enough blood to sustain tissues throughout a body of that size, breathing with lungs powerful enough to ventilate such an enormous volume, supporting the weight of the neck and tail against gravity, without the animal's own skeleton crushing it, required biological solutions that we are still working to understand fully. The pneumatized skeleton, those hollow, air-filled bones, was part of the answer. By replacing bone with air, the sauropods maintained structural integrity while dramatically reducing weight. The vertebrae of large sauropods are engineering marvels, honeycomb structures of thin bone struts that achieve maximum strength at minimum mass, in patterns that look almost designed and yet arose through millions of years of random variation and selection. We do not fully understand how they did it, which is, I think, one of the most wonderful things about paleontology. 60 years of intensive work on the most intensively studied group of extinct animals in history, and there are still things about the most basic biology of these creatures that remain deeply mysterious. The past still holds secrets, and every year, somewhere on this planet, someone gets to be the first human being to see a dinosaur no human has ever seen before. A tooth here, a partial femur there, a beautifully preserved skull emerging from ancient sandstone after 75 million years of waiting. That thought makes me happy, even now. It should make you happy too. While we have focused primarily on the birds as the great dinosaurian survivors of the KPG extinction, it is worth spending a few moments with the other ancient lineages that made it through the darkness, because they too are part of the deep story, and they too inhabit the world around us today, carrying their own extraordinary histories in their biology. The crocodilians, the crocodiles, alligators, and gharials of the modern world are among the oldest living vertebrate lineages on Earth. Their basic body plan has changed remarkably little in the last 85 million years. The American alligator lurking in a Louisiana bayou today would have been recognizable in its broad outlines to a late Cretaceous observer. How did they survive when so many other large animals did not? Crocodilians are opportunistic generalists. They can go without food for extraordinarily long periods, months in some circumstances, surviving on the reserves stored in their massive tails and body fat. They are ectothermic, which means their metabolic rate is low to begin with, requiring far fewer calories to maintain their physiology than a similarly sized endothermic animal. And they are associated with freshwater environments, aquatic ecosystems, where the food web collapse was somewhat buffered compared to the catastrophic failure of terrestrial food webs. River systems carried nutrients and organic matter from the devastated terrestrial environments. Aquatic insects and freshwater fish, more resilient than their terrestrial counterparts, maintained populations that provided food for the crocodilians and other aquatic survivors. The water, in the terrible months after the impact, was a somewhat safer place than the land. And the turtles. The turtles survived too, largely through the same combination of factors: low metabolic needs, aquatic lifestyle, extraordinary physiological resilience. Turtles have been around for over 220 million years. They watched the first dinosaurs evolve. They watched the great diversification of the Jurassic. They watched the extinction. And they are still here, unchanged in their essential architecture, carrying their houses on their backs through ponds and rivers and oceans across the world. There is something profoundly humbling about a turtle. When you look at one, really look at one, watching the ancient patience in those amber eyes, you are looking at a design that evolution perfected and then stopped fiddling with. That slow, deliberate movement, the retraction into the shell, the unhurried pace through a world that has changed beyond recognition since the turtle body plan first appeared. The leatherback sea turtle can weigh over 2,000 pounds and dive to depths of over 4,000 feet. It crosses entire ocean basins on its migrations, navigating by magnetic fields to find the beaches where it was born, returning across thousands of miles of open sea with a reliability that seems almost supernatural. It has been doing this, in essentially this form, since before the asteroid hit. And the snakes, the lizards, the frogs, the salamanders, all survivors of the KPG extinction, all carrying their own deep time histories. The caecilians, the legless, burrowing amphibians that most people have never heard of, have a fossil record extending back over 250 million years. They survived the Permian extinction, the Triassic extinction, and the KPG extinction. They are burrowing through tropical soils today in South America and Africa and Asia, utterly unchanged in their basic architecture, ancient beyond imagining. The world is full of survivors. Every living thing around you is the product of an unbroken chain of survival stretching back to the origin of life itself. Every bacterium, every plant, every insect, every frog calling in a summer pond, every bird at your feeder. Not one of them has an extinct ancestor, because an extinct ancestor, by definition, left no descendants. Every living thing is, in the most literal possible sense, a winner, a survivor of every catastrophe that has ever threatened life on Earth across 4 billion years of biological history. Sit with that for a moment. You are part of that continuum. Your ancestors, every single one of them back to the first self-replicating molecules in the primordial ocean, survived. Everything that life has thrown at them, they survived. The extinctions, the catastrophes, the ice ages, the famines, the predators, the pathogens, all of it survived to produce you. That is worth knowing as you lie here in the dark. The birds survived the asteroid. They survived 66 million years of changing climates, shifting continents, rising and falling seas. They survived the ice ages, the drying of the Sahara, the rise of the Himalayas, but they are not surviving us. Not all of them. The modern biodiversity crisis, sometimes called the sixth mass extinction, or the Anthropocene extinction, is, in its speed, unprecedented in Earth's history. Even the KPG extinction, catastrophic as it was, unfolded over a timescale of thousands of years. The current wave of species loss is occurring over decades and centuries. Roughly 12% of bird species are currently considered threatened with extinction. Since 1500, at least 187 bird species are known to have gone extinct, and this is certainly a significant underestimate, as island species in particular were often lost before they could be formally documented. The passenger pigeon, the great auk, the dodo, the Carolina parakeet, the Labrador duck, the Hoya of New Zealand. These are not just names on a list. They were species with millions of years of evolutionary history behind them. The passenger pigeon, famously, may have been the most numerous bird in North America at the time of European contact, perhaps 3 to 5 billion individuals, comprising perhaps 25 to 40% of all birds on the continent. Flocks described by 19th century naturalists darkened the sky for hours as they passed, taking days to fly over a single location. By 1914, the last passenger pigeon, a female named Martha, died in the Cincinnati Zoo, from billions to zero in less than a century. There are stories of extraordinary recovery, and these deserve to be told too. The bald eagle, the national symbol of the United States, was in catastrophic decline through the mid-20th century, largely due to the pesticide DDT, which caused the eggshell thinning that devastated reproduction. By 1963, only 417 nesting pairs remained in the contiguous United States. The banning of DDT in 1972, combined with active conservation efforts, legal protection under the Endangered Species Act, and captive breeding and reintroduction programs, allowed the bald eagle to recover in one of conservation biology's greatest successes. Today, there are more than 9,000 nesting pairs in the contiguous United States. The whooping crane, North America's tallest bird, fell to just 21 individuals in the wild in 1941. Through one of the most intensive conservation programs in history, including carefully managed captive breeding and the painstaking teaching of migration routes to captive-bred birds, using ultralight aircraft to lead juveniles along the flyway for the first time, the population has recovered to several hundred individuals. The kakapo, the world's largest parrot, a flightless nocturnal bird from New Zealand, fell to just 51 individuals in the early 1990s. An intensive island sanctuary program involving the translocation of every remaining bird to predator-free islands and intensive management of breeding has brought the population back above 200. These recoveries are not automatic. They require sustained human effort, political will, and often the investment of significant resources over decades. But they demonstrate something crucial: species can come back. Given the right conditions, the right protections, the right management, populations that have fallen to desperate lows can rebuild. The lineage that survived the asteroid impact, that rebuilt a world from ashes, that has been woven into the fabric of every terrestrial ecosystem for 66 million years, this lineage has proven its resilience over and over again. But resilience has limits, and the pace of human impact is testing those limits in ways that no previous challenge has. I think about this sometimes when I hear a bird. Any bird. The early morning chorus, the way it builds from the first tentative calls before dawn, to the full layered, multi-species symphony of a summer morning. There is something in that sound that feels ancient, because it is. What you're hearing in the morning chorus is 66 million years of survival. 165 million years of dinosaurian presence on this planet. A thread of life that runs from the Triassic, through fire and extinction, and the long darkness, all the way to this morning, this window, this moment. It is worth protecting. There is a particular quality of attention required to be a good paleontologist, a kind of patient, almost meditative engagement with materials that give up their secrets only reluctantly, only to those willing to sit with them long enough to learn their language. Consider what a paleontologist actually holds in their hands when they examine a dinosaur bone. The organic material, the collagen, the DNA, the cellular structures, is almost certainly gone, replaced over millions of years by minerals that have percolated through the porous bone matrix and crystallized in the spaces left by decaying organic compounds. What remains is, in effect, a faithful rock replica of the original bone, preserving the external shape and often remarkable internal detail, but chemically transformed into something entirely different from the original. And yet this mineralized copy contains extraordinary information. Growth rings in dinosaur bone, similar to the annual rings in tree trunks, deposited as growth slows each year, allow paleontologists to age individuals with remarkable precision. A cross-section of a T-Rex femur, examined under polarized light, reveals a series of rings that tell the story of that individual's life. This is how we know that T-Rex grew fastest between the ages of perhaps 14 and 18, a period of nearly a pound of new growth per day in some individuals. Muscle attachment scars on bones tell us about the muscular architecture of an animal, where the major muscles attached, how large they likely were, what range of motion the joints allowed. From these scars, researchers can reconstruct the movement of animals they have never seen alive with surprising accuracy. One of the most extraordinary recent discoveries involved the preservation of soft tissue in dinosaur bone. Mary Schweitzer, a paleontologist at North Carolina State University, discovered that exceptionally preserved tyrannosaur bones sometimes retained what appeared to be original soft tissue, flexible vessel-like structures, what appeared to be red blood cell remnants, fibrous material that reacted with antibodies to collagen. The discovery was controversial. The debate continues. But subsequent work has confirmed that at least some chemical signatures from original proteins can survive in dinosaur bone under the right conditions, preserved through a process of iron-mediated cross-linking that prevents complete degradation. We may, quite literally, still have pieces of actual dinosaur protein, not just rock copies of dinosaur protein, but the original molecular structures themselves, changed and degraded but still partially present millions of years after the animal died. Modern genomic techniques have opened an entirely new window into the past. By comparing the DNA sequences of living species and applying molecular clock methods, which use the known rate of genetic mutation to estimate the time since two lineages diverged, researchers can reconstruct evolutionary family trees with remarkable precision. This approach has transformed our understanding of bird evolution in particular. The great burst of avian diversification in the immediate aftermath of the KPG extinction, the bottleneck followed by the explosion, is written into the genomes of every living bird. We carry the memory of the asteroid impact in our DNA, all of us, and the birds outside your window carry it in theirs. There is something strangely comforting in that thought, I think. That time leaves traces, that even the most catastrophic events are recorded in stone and in the living code of organisms, waiting to be read by those patient enough to look. The rocks remember everything, and slowly, patiently, we are learning to listen. Let me end before the final closing with something immediate and present and real. Think about the last bird you saw, not a memory from a documentary or a photograph. The actual last bird you encountered, perhaps a pigeon on a city street, or a sparrow at a window, or a crow on a fence post, or a gull wheeling over a parking lot. That bird, whatever species it was, is doing something remarkable simply by existing. By being alive in this moment, carrying inside its body a set of biological systems of extraordinary complexity and elegance. Its skeleton is a marvel of lightweight engineering, hollow bones laced with air, yet strong enough to withstand the mechanical forces of flight, the impact of landing, the stresses of a life lived largely in 3 dimensions. Every gram of weight saved is a gram less that the flight muscles must lift against gravity. Its feathers, each one a precisely structured array of interlocking barbules, hooking together with tiny hooks to create a smooth, aerodynamic surface that can be instantly repaired by preening when the hooks become disengaged, are biological nanotechnology of extraordinary sophistication. The same feather structure that insulates against cold also provides lift, controls drag, and serves as a visual signal to other birds. Its respiratory system, as we discussed, is unidirectional. Air flows in one direction only, through the lungs, into a series of air sacs that act like bellows, then back out through the lungs again. This system extracts oxygen from the air with an efficiency that makes our own back and forth breathing seem almost wasteful. Its immune system is adapted to the pathogens it encounters on migration routes spanning continents. Its circadian rhythms are exquisitely tuned to the photoperiod, the length of the day triggering migration, molt and breeding at precisely the right moments of the year in response to changing day length. Its eyes, in most species, can detect 4 color channels rather than our 3, including ultraviolet light. The world a bird sees is literally more colorful than the world we see, with patterns invisible to us blazing on flower petals and feathers and fruit skins, a whole visual dimension of the world that we're simply unable to perceive without instruments. And its brain, compact, dense with neurons, organized differently from ours but no less capable of the cognitive feats that define intelligence, is processing all of this information, integrating sensory inputs from multiple channels, planning movements, recognizing individuals, remembering locations, communicating through learned vocalizations. All of this in a body that weighs, in the case of a sparrow, perhaps an ounce. The next time you see a bird, any bird, I hope you will carry some of this with you, the sense of what you're actually looking at. Not a simple creature, not a background element of the natural world, but a 230 million year lineage refined by selection across inconceivable spans of time brought to its present perfect form by every extinction and recovery and adaptation and diversification that has occurred since the first small dinosaur stood upright on a Triassic plain. It is a daily miracle hiding in plain sight, and it is singing, out there in the dark, right now. for you. And so we come to the end of our journey through deep time, from the Triassic forests where the first small dinosaurs stood upright and blinked at a world that would be theirs for 165 million years, through the rise of the great sauropods, the theropods, the armored ankylosaurs, the horned ceratopsians, the extraordinary tapestry of Mesozoic life in all its diversity. Through the quiet, persistent thread of the feathered ones, the small, the quick, the warm, the winged, who were evolving in the undergrowth and the canopy, refining flight, learning to sing, building in their tiny bodies the biological toolkit that would allow them to survive what nothing else could. Through the impact itself that single afternoon, 66 million years ago, when the sky fell and the world changed forever, through the long darkness and the fern spike and the slow rebuilding of a broken world, through the extraordinary radiation of the birds in the Paleogene, the terror birds and the diving birds and the hummingbirds and the songbirds, as they filled a world emptied of its former masters, and into the present, into the forests and fields and coastlines and cities where 10,000 species of avian dinosaur make their lives today. The story of the dinosaurs is not a story of loss. It is, in the deepest sense, a story of transformation and of persistence. The dinosaurs are still here. They wake before dawn every morning and they sing. And as you drift towards sleep now, let that thought settle gently around you. Outside, somewhere in the dark, a bird is perched on a branch or tucked into a nest, feathers fluffed against the night air, breathing in and out with those ancient lungs. It carries 230 million years of history in its hollow bones. It survived the end of the world, and it is still here. Still here. Rest now. Let the ancient world recede. Let the darkness be gentle. Let your breathing slow to the rhythm of something very old and very patient. The dinosaurs are watching over the night, and the morning chorus, when it comes, will be their gift to you. If you were with us in part 1, you know the broad arc of the story, the asteroid, the darkness, the long recovery, the birds scratching through the ash of a broken world, finding seeds, surviving. Tonight, I want to go deeper into one particular thread, a thread that I think does not get nearly enough attention, and that I find endlessly fascinating the more I sit with it. It is the story of small things, because the dinosaur story is almost always told as a story of giants, of size and scale and spectacle. And that makes sense. The giants are what stop us in our tracks in museum halls, what fill children's imaginations, what fuel the blockbusters. There is something about sheer scale that the human mind responds to with a kind of awe that bypasses ordinary thought entirely. But the giants were not the whole story. They were never the whole story. Running beneath their feet, quite literally, were the small dinosaurs, the chicken-sized, the sparrow-sized, the creatures that left, barely a trace in the fossil record because they were simply too delicate, too lightly built, too easily destroyed by the indifferent processes of geological time. These small ones, the ones that shrank over millions of years, that grew feathers, that climbed into the trees and eventually took to the air, these are the ones who are still here. And their story begins with a question that paleontologists have been wrestling with for decades. Why did some dinosaur lineages get smaller over time, while others grew ever larger? Part of the answer lies in ecology. In any given ecosystem, there are real advantages to both strategies. Large body size brings protection from predators, access to food sources unavailable to smaller animals, the ability to travel long distances efficiently, the capacity to store energy reserves that carry an animal through lean seasons. A sauropod, for all its physiological demands, was essentially predator-proof once it reached full size, but small body size has its own formidable advantages: the ability to hide, the capacity to survive on minimal food intake, the metabolic flexibility to exploit resources, insects, seeds, small prey, fungi, carrion, that large animals cannot efficiently access, and, crucially, the ability to breed quickly and recover rapidly from population crashes. The theropod lineage that would eventually produce birds underwent a sustained directional trend towards smaller body size across the Jurassic and into the Cretaceous. This is documented in the fossil record with unusual clarity. The ancestors of birds were, generation by generation, getting smaller, a process that took tens of millions of years, but was consistent enough to show up as a clear statistical trend when you plot body size estimates against geological time. This miniaturization was not simply a shrinking of a large animal into a small one. It was accompanied by profound changes in anatomy, physiology, and behaviour. The bones became more hollow, more pneumatized, more lightweight. The metabolic rate increased, the animals became more active, running hotter, burning more energy per unit of body mass, but also capable of more sustained activity, more complex behaviour, more rapid response to their environment. The brain proportionally grew larger. This is a consistent pattern across vertebrate evolution. Smaller animals, particularly active insectivores and omnivores, tend to have proportionally larger brains than their larger relatives. The demands of navigating a complex environment at small scale, of tracking and catching fast-moving prey, of evading a larger range of predators, these demands drive neural investment in ways that the life of a large, slow-moving herbivore simply does not. The feathers appeared. First as simple filaments, insulation for small, warm-blooded animals that needed to maintain body temperature against the chill of a Jurassic night, in a world full of larger, slower, cooler competitors. Then as more complex structures, with branching barbs and interlocking barbules. Then as structures capable of generating aerodynamic forces. Then, finally, as wings. It is tempting to tell this story teleologically, as if the small theropods were heading somewhere, as if evolution had a destination in mind. It did not. Evolution never has a destination. Each step was simply whatever worked well enough in the conditions that existed at that particular moment to produce enough surviving offspring to keep the lineage going. But looking back across the sweep of deep time, there is something almost narrative about it, as if the lineage was, across 80 million years of gradual change, slowly building itself a set of tools that would, entirely by accident, turn out to be exactly right for surviving the worst day in the history of complex life on this planet. Small, warm, feathered, fast-breeding, flexible in diet. Every one of those features evolved for reasons that had nothing to do with asteroid impacts, and every one of them saved the lineage when the asteroid came. There is a philosophical resonance in that which I find deeply comforting, lying here in the dark. The qualities we develop for ordinary reasons, for the daily demands of surviving and reproducing in our particular circumstances, sometimes turn out to be exactly the qualities we need for the extraordinary challenges we never saw coming. We do not know what we are preparing for. We only know that the work of each ordinary day, done with care and consistency, builds something. The small theropods did not know they were becoming birds. They were just trying to find enough to eat and stay warm through the Jurassic night and raise their offspring and do it all again the next day. And in doing so, across millions of generations, they built something that would outlast everything around them. There is one more piece of this story I want to leave you with tonight, a detail so specific, so strange, that I find it hard to let go of once I have encountered it. In the weeks and months after the Chicxulub impact, as the darkness settled and the temperature dropped and the food web began to unravel, one of the few reliable food sources remaining across the devastated landscape was something paleontologists call the carrion pulse. The mass death of so many large animals, the hadrosaurs, the ceratopsians, the sauropods, the ankylosaurs, all collapsing as the plants they depended on died in the dark, left an extraordinary abundance of dead organic material scattered across continents. Carcasses by the millions, a landscape of the fallen. For scavengers and opportunistic feeders, the immediate aftermath of the extinction was, in a terrible way, a feast. The small generalist birds and the small mammals alongside them were extraordinarily well positioned to exploit this pulse. They could process carrion alongside seeds, alongside insects, alongside decaying plant matter, alongside whatever else they could locate and consume. They were not choosy, they could not afford to be choosy, and in that inability to be choosy, in that enforced flexibility, lay survival. And so, while the giants were dying of starvation around them, the small ones were, for a brief and terrible window, actually well fed. It sounds almost grotesque, and perhaps it is. There is something uncomfortable about sitting with that image, the small bright-eyed birds picking through the wreckage of a world, nourished by the deaths of creatures they had shared that world with for millions of years. But it is also, in its own way, a reminder of something deeply true about the nature of resilience. The survivors of catastrophe are rarely the strongest, or the most spectacular, or the most perfectly adapted to the conditions that existed before the catastrophe. They are the most flexible, the most willing to work with whatever the world offers, even when what the world offers is ash and darkness and the remnants of a collapsed ecosystem. The bird on your windowsill pecking at seeds, watching you with one bright ancient eye, perfectly at ease in a world of glass and steel and concrete that its ancestors could never have imagined, is the inheritor of that flexibility. It carries in its behaviour and its biology the deep imprint of a lineage that has navigated catastrophe before. It survived an asteroid. A little bit of glass and concrete is nothing. Rest now. Let the story settle around you like the darkness outside your window. The ancient ones are still out there, in the trees, on the rooftops, tucked into their nests with feathers fluffed against the night, adapting as they always have, watching the world change around them with the patient equanimity of a lineage that has seen far worse. They have seen the sky fall, they have seen the darkness last for years, they have seen a world end and rebuilt themselves, quietly, in the ruins, and when the sun came back, they were singing. There is something extraordinary happening inside a bird egg. Not the hatching, not the chick forming from yolk and albumen over the quiet weeks of incubation, something earlier than that. Something that happens at the very moment the egg is laid, or rather, something that was already there long before the egg existed at all. Every bird egg carries, encoded in the DNA of the embryo inside it, a complete record of its lineage. Not a written record, not a conscious one, but a molecular archive stretching back through every ancestor that ever lived and reproduced and died, all the way back, if you follow the chain far enough, to the very first self-replicating molecules in the ancient ocean. Every egg is a message from the past to the future. I find this almost unbearably moving when I truly sit with it. The egg on the nest, whether it belongs to a wren in a hedgerow, or an ostrich on an African plain, or an emperor penguin balanced on the feet of a male in the Antarctic winter, contains inside its modest shell a thread of biological continuity that has never once been broken across 4 billion years of life on Earth. Not once. Every ancestor of that egg reproduced successfully, every single one, through every ice age and every mass extinction and every drought and every predator and every pathogen. That particular thread of life found a way to continue. The egg on the nest is not just a new life beginning, it is an ancient life continuing, expressing itself in a new form, in a new moment, but drawing on a heritage that reaches into unimaginable depths of time. The dinosaurian heritage is written into bird eggs in ways that are not merely metaphorical. The hard-shelled, amniotic egg, the egg with its own internal water supply, independent of the external aquatic environment, was one of the great evolutionary innovations of the early reptiles, appearing perhaps 320 million years ago. It was this innovation that freed the early amniotes from dependence on water for reproduction, allowing them to colonize dry land fully for the first time. Dinosaurs were amniotes. They laid eggs. All of them, as far as we can tell from the fossil record. Dinosaur nests have been found across the world, in Mongolia, in Argentina, in China, in North America, and they reveal a reproductive behaviour of surprising complexity, and in some cases, unexpected tenderness. Maiasaura, the hadrosaur whose name translates as good mother lizard, was discovered nesting in large colonies in what is now Montana, in a location called Egg Mountain. The nests were arranged in groups, spaced roughly the distance of one adult body length apart, suggesting the nesting colony was a structured social arrangement rather than a random aggregation. Juveniles found near the nests showed worn teeth, evidence that they were being fed by adults rather than immediately foraging for themselves. Parental care in dinosaurs, the tending of eggs, the feeding of young, these behaviours which we associate so strongly with birds and with mammals, were already present in the non-avian dinosaurs tens of millions of years before the extinction. The birds inherited this legacy, and they took it further. The emperor penguin's incubation of its single egg through the Antarctic winter, balanced on the feet, covered by a flap of warm belly skin, in temperatures that plunged to minus 40 degrees Celsius, without food, for up to 65 days, is perhaps the most extreme expression of parental dedication in the bird world. But it is not an aberration. It is the culmination of a 165 million year tradition of egg tending, nest building, chick rearing that runs unbroken from the Triassic to the present. Lie still for a moment and let that continuity settle around you. The instinct that drives a penguin to stand in the polar dark, burning its own body, reserves to keep a single egg warm. That instinct has ancestors, ancient ancestors, expressed differently in different bodies, in different environments, but fundamentally the same deep biological drive. Protect the next generation. Keep the thread unbroken. It is the oldest story life knows how to tell. And it is being told tonight, right now, in nests on every continent. In the hollow of a tree where an owl incubates her clutch in the cold dark. In the woven grass cup of a wren's nest tucked into a hedge, barely visible even in daylight. In the scrape on a shingle beach where a ringed plover sits motionless over her eggs, her cryptic plumage making her almost invisible against the stones. In the elaborate mud tower of a flamingo colony, each nest a small volcano of dried mud, each egg balanced at the summit. In each of these places tonight the ancient story is continuing. The egg is warm, the thread holds, and somewhere in the molecular architecture of each of those eggs, in the precise sequence of base pairs strung along the DNA, is the memory of the Cretaceous, the memory of ancestors who survived the asteroid, the memory of a world that ended and a lineage that continued regardless. We carry our histories in our bodies, every living thing does. Sleep now, the thread is holding, it always has. We have travelled a long way together, through the Triassic plains where the first small dinosaurs stood upright into a hot and unfamiliar world, through the Jurassic canopies where feathered things began to experiment with the air, through the rich, crowded Cretaceous, the world of giants, of herds, of a sky so full of life that silence itself must have been a rare and precious thing, through the impact, through the long dark, through the slow, patient rebuilding of a world from seeds and ash. And now here we are, the end of the story, or rather, the place where the story opens into the present, and the present opens into whatever comes next. I want to spend these final minutes not with science, but with something quieter, with the simple fact of being here, in the dark, in a world that is, against all probability, against the odds that any particular moment of geological history would produce beings capable of sitting with this story, alive. Think about what 66 million years actually means. If you compress the entire time since the asteroid into a single calendar year, with the impact happening on the first second of January 1st, then the first modern humans, Homo sapiens, would not appear until roughly the 31st of December. In the final hours of December 31st, the whole of recorded human history, every civilization, every war, every poem, every scientific discovery, every empire that rose and fell, would occupy the last 90 seconds of that year. And the birds would have been present for every single day of it. All 365, singing through the Eocene and the Oligocene and the Miocene and the Pliocene and the Pleistocene, present when the first hominids stood upright on African savannas, present when our ancestors crossed land bridges into new continents, present in the trees above the first human fires, in the skies above the first cities, on the rooftops of every civilization that has ever existed. They were never not here, and there is something in that constancy that I find genuinely steadying. Not comforting in the sense of making problems smaller, but steadying in the sense of placing things in proportion, of providing a frame of reference that extends beyond the merely human. Human history is extraordinary. What we have built and thought and felt and made in our brief time on this planet is remarkable by any measure. But it is very short, and the world it sits within is very old, and the creatures that share that world with us, the birds especially, those direct descendants of the most successful terrestrial vertebrate radiation in Earth's history, are far older than we are and will almost certainly outlast us, and carry in their biology a set of solutions to the problem of survival that we have barely begun to understand. There is a practice in certain philosophical traditions of deliberately widening one's perspective, of zooming out from the immediate concerns of the present moment to take in a larger view. Not to diminish what is immediate and personal, but to hold it within a context that reveals both its smallness and, paradoxically, its preciousness. Deep time is that practice taken to its ultimate expression. When you truly sit with the timeline of life on Earth, when you hold in your mind, even imperfectly, the 4 billion years of biological history that produced this moment, your own moment becomes strange and bright and particular in a way it rarely does in ordinary life. You're a very specific configuration of matter that exists for a very brief time in a very particular corner of a very ancient universe, and you are right now aware of that fact. No Triceratops was aware of that. No sauropod contemplated its own place in geological time. No Cretaceous bird scratching through the ash for seeds after the impact, understood that it was the sole surviving representative of a 165 million year lineage, keeping something irreplaceable alive through an apocalypse. But you can know that. You can hold that story. And in holding it, you're doing something genuinely new in the history of life on this planet. Something that no organism in 4 billion years of evolution has been able to do before. You are witnessing. You are the universe becoming aware of its own deep past. That is not a small thing. Tomorrow morning, whenever the morning comes for you, a bird will sing before the light. It will sing in the dark as its ancestors have sung in the dark for tens of millions of years, carrying a tradition of vocal expression that predates every human language by an almost incomprehensible margin. It will not know that you are listening. It will not know that you spent tonight travelling back through 230 million years of its family history. It will simply sing as it was built to sing because singing is what it does. But you will know, and knowing changes the hearing. The sparrow becomes something more than a sparrow. The crow on the fence post becomes a theropod descended from creatures that survived the worst day in the history of life. The swift cutting through the summer sky becomes the endpoint of 80 million years of miniaturization and feather refinement and metabolic reconfiguration, all pointing toward this moment of perfect, effortless, impossible flight. Every bird you will ever see for the rest of your life carries that weight of history, and they carry it lightly, because that is what hollow bones are for. So here is where we leave it, in the quiet dark. The dinosaurs did not disappear. They transformed. They miniaturized and took to the air and survived what nothing else survived and built a world of 10,000 species and filled every sky and every forest and every coastline and every mountain range with colour and song and movement and life. And they are here tonight. Somewhere in the dark outside, feathers are fluffed against the cold. Ancient lungs are drawing air in that unidirectional flow that evolution perfected long before our ancestors climbed down from any tree. Ancient eyes are closed, or watching, or dreaming in whatever way a bird dreams. The thread holds. It held through the fire and the dark and the long, cold recovery. It is holding now, and somewhere, just before dawn, it will sing. There is something I have been holding back. Through every part of this series we have moved through the science confidently. The asteroid, the feathers, the survivors, the deep time mathematics of evolution, and all of that is real. Documented, tested, refined by generations of researchers working with extraordinary care and rigour. But science, for all its power, has edges, places where the evidence runs thin, where the fossils stop telling their story clearly, where the models break down and the researchers look at each other across the lab bench and say quietly that they do not know. Tonight, we are going to those edges, because the mystery parts of the dinosaur story are, if anything, more fascinating than the parts we think we understand, and I think you deserve to know about them, to lie here in the dark and let the uncertainty be part of the story, rather than something tidied away behind confident narration. So, the questions that keep the paleontologist awake at night. Let's begin. Were dinosaurs warm-blooded or cold-blooded? It sounds like a question that should have been settled decades ago, and in the popular press it largely has been. The modern consensus, reported as settled fact, is that dinosaurs were warm-blooded, endothermic, metabolically active creatures much more like birds and mammals than like modern reptiles. But the truth inside the research community is considerably more complicated, and considerably more interesting. The evidence for endothermy in dinosaurs is real and substantial. The bone microstructure of most dinosaurs shows the rapid, highly vascularized growth patterns associated with warm-blooded animals. The discovery of feathers in so many theropod lineages strongly implies insulation, which implies a body that generated its own heat and needed to retain it. The posture and locomotion of dinosaurs, upright, with legs beneath the body, is associated in living animals with higher metabolic rates. And yet, when researchers began measuring growth rates and metabolic proxies more carefully across the whole dinosaur family tree, the picture became murkier. Some dinosaur lineages showed growth rates intermediate between modern ectotherms and endotherms, neither fully cold-blooded nor fully warm-blooded in the way we understand those terms. A concept called mesothermy emerged, the idea that some dinosaurs ran at metabolic rates between the two extremes, generating some internal heat but not maintaining the constant, precisely regulated body temperature of a modern bird or mammal. The large sauropods present a particular puzzle. Animals of 50 or 70 tons have an extremely low surface area to volume ratio. They lose heat very slowly simply because of their bulk. A truly endothermic sauropod generating heat like a modern mammal would likely have overheated catastrophically. The term gigantothermy has been proposed for animals so large that their sheer mass keeps them warm, regardless of their underlying metabolic rate. So were the sauropods gigantothermic, mesothermic, something else entirely that we don't have a word for yet? The honest answer is that we don't fully know. The fossil record preserves bones and teeth and impressions. It does not preserve metabolic rates. Every inference we make about dinosaur physiology is exactly that. An inference, built on indirect evidence and analogy with living animals. And there is something quietly thrilling about that uncertainty. It means the dinosaurs remain, in some fundamental sense, unknowable. We can get close. We can build increasingly detailed models. But the last mile of understanding, the actual lived experience of being a dinosaur, the feeling of that body from the inside, is forever beyond our reach. They keep their secrets. You might think, given the extraordinary richness of the feathered dinosaur fossil record from China and elsewhere, that we have a clear, continuous picture of exactly how birds evolved. From their theropod ancestors, step by step, bone by bone, feature by feature, we do not. The origin of birds is one of the most intensely debated topics in all of vertebrate paleontology. Not because there is any serious doubt that birds are dinosaurs, that much is as settled as anything in science. But the specific pathway, the precise sequence of anatomical changes, the exact branching point at which the bird lineage diverged from its closest non-avian relatives, these remain genuinely contested. Archaeopteryx, discovered in 1861 and long held up as the definitive transitional form between dinosaurs and birds, has had a complicated scientific life. For most of the 20th century it was considered the first bird, the anchor point of the avian lineage. Then a series of analyses suggested it might actually be a non-avian dinosaur that happened to have flight feathers. Then subsequent analyses pushed it back toward the base of the bird lineage. The argument continues. The Chinese feathered dinosaurs complicated things further. Some of them, like Anchiornis and Geotingia, turned out to be more closely related to birds than Archaeopteryx is, but appear in the fossil record before Archaeopteryx. This creates a temporal paradox that the fossil record cannot currently resolve. Either these animals are misdated, or the lineage is more complex than a simple linear progression, with multiple experiments in feathered flight happening in parallel across the late Jurassic. The trees down versus ground up debate also remains open. Did the first flying ancestors of birds glide from trees, gradually refining their aerodynamic control? Or did they develop flight from the ground up, perhaps as running animals that used feathered arms for balance or prey capture, and gradually discovered that those arm movements generated lift? Or, as many current researchers suspect, was it some combination, with different lineages taking different routes toward the same destination? There is also the question of how many times flight evolved in the dinosaur lineage. In living animals, flight has evolved independently at least 4 times, in insects, in pterosaurs, in birds, and in bats. Within the feathered dinosaurs specifically, some researchers argue that flight may have evolved and been lost and re-evolved multiple times, with different lineages independently discovering the aerodynamic potential of their feathered arms. Microraptor, the 4-winged dinosaur from the early Cretaceous of China, presents a particularly bewildering case. It had large flight feathers not just on its arms but on its hind legs, a configuration unlike anything in modern birds. Could it fly? Almost certainly in some fashion. But how? Biplane style, with all 4 wings generating lift, using the hind wings primarily for control, gliding from trees. No consensus has been reached. The origin of bird flight, one of the most consequential evolutionary transitions in the history of vertebrate life, remains in its precise details a mystery. I find this wonderful. The moment that changed everything. The moment when a small theropod first became truly airborne. When gravity was first truly defeated by feathers and hollow bones and the right angle into the wind, that moment is lost to us. We will never see it. We can only approach it from either side, from the fossils that came before and the birds that came after, and infer the crossing of a threshold we can never directly observe. Something extraordinary happened. We know it happened. We just don't know exactly how. Here is a mystery that sits at the very heart of the survival story, and it is one that I have never heard discussed in any popular account of the KPG extinction. If the birds survived the asteroid because they were small, warm-blooded, feathered, seed-eating generalists, then why did only some birds survive? Because not all of them did. The Enantiornithines, sometimes called the opposite birds, because several of their skeletal features are reversed compared to modern birds, were the dominant bird group of the Cretaceous. They were extraordinarily diverse, hundreds of species ranging from sparrow-sized to large crow-sized, occupying a huge range of ecological niches. They were in the trees and on the ground and at the water's edge. Many of them were almost certainly small, feathered, and metabolically active. They all died. Every single Enantiornithine lineage went extinct at the KPE boundary. Not one survived. The group that had dominated bird diversity for 80 million years vanished completely, leaving not a single descendant. Meanwhile, the ancestors of modern birds, the Neornithines, survived. Why? What did they have that the Enantiornithines lacked? This is one of the genuinely open questions in avian paleontology, and the honest answer is that we do not know. Several hypotheses have been proposed. Some researchers argue that Neornithines were more strongly associated with ground-dwelling and seed-eating habits, while Enantiornithines were more arboreal and dependent on insect and fruit food sources that collapsed catastrophically after the impact. But the evidence for this dietary distinction is incomplete. Others have suggested that Neornithines had faster developmental rates, that their chicks grew more quickly to independence, giving the lineage a reproductive advantage in the chaos of the post-impact world. There is some fossil evidence consistent with this, but not conclusive proof. Still others point to geographic distribution. Perhaps the Neornithine ancestors happened to be concentrated in regions that were somewhat less affected by the immediate catastrophe, and the Enantiornithines were more concentrated in areas that experienced more severe environmental disruption. But here is the thing. None of these explanations fully satisfy. The Enantiornithines were too diverse, too widespread, too ecologically varied for any single factor to explain why every last one of them died, while enough Neornithines survived to rebuild the world. There may have been an element of pure chance involved, of random survival, the geological equivalent of a coin flip, where the lineage that happened to have even one individual in the right place, at the right time, with the right combination of individually unremarkable traits, survived while an entire parallel world of birds went dark. The Enantiornithines were beautiful. They were successful. For 80 million years they were the birds of the Mesozoic world, filling the trees and shorelines and forest floors of every continent. And they are gone so completely that most people have never heard of them. There are no Enantiornithine birds today, no descendants, no evolutionary legacy except in the rocks. An entire 80 million year experiment in what it means to be a bird, ending in silence. That silence is one of the things I find most haunting in all of paleontology, and we still don't fully understand why. Here is something the popular accounts almost never mention. The asteroid almost certainly caused the mass extinction. The evidence for this is overwhelming and, by this point, essentially beyond serious scientific dispute. The iridium layer, the shocked quartz, the impact spherules distributed globally, the Chicxulub crater itself, its age now pinned to within 33,000 years of the KPG boundary. The timing is not a coincidence. But the asteroid did not arrive into a healthy, stable world. It arrived into a world that was already under significant stress. The Deccan Traps, a massive volcanic province in what is now Western India, were erupting on a colossal scale in the final million years of the Cretaceous. These were not ordinary volcanic eruptions. The Deccan Traps represent one of the largest volcanic events in Earth's history, producing lava flows that cover an area roughly the size of France and Germany, combined to depths of over a mile. The volcanic activity pumped significant quantities of carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere, causing climate instability and ocean acidification that were already stressing ecosystems before the asteroid arrived. Some researchers have argued that the dinosaurs were already in decline before the impact, that the late Cretaceous saw a slow erosion of dinosaur diversity that the asteroid merely finished off. Others dispute this strongly, arguing that the fossil record in the final few million years of the Cretaceous shows a rich and apparently thriving dinosaur fauna that shows no clear signs of terminal decline. The debate matters because it changes the story. If the dinosaurs were already weakened, then the asteroid was the last blow to an already faltering giant. The extinction looks more like a cascade of stresses rather than a single clean catastrophe. If the dinosaurs were thriving until the impact, then the asteroid alone was sufficient, and the world could have continued indefinitely under dinosaurian dominance if that one rock had missed. And the volcanic debate has recently become more complex still. New geochronological work has suggested that the Deccan eruptions may actually have intensified after the impact, that the shockwaves from Chicxulub travelling through the planet's interior may have triggered a pulse of increased volcanic activity on the opposite side of the Earth. So the asteroid and the volcanism may not be independent events at all. They may be connected, the impact amplifying the volcanic stress in ways that compounded the extinction's severity. The end of the Cretaceous, it turns out, may have been even more complicated than we thought. Not a single cause and a single effect. A web of interacting stresses, each amplifying the others, producing an outcome that no single cause alone could have generated. The ancient world ended in complexity. As all things do, we have talked about the silence of lost lineages. But here is a mystery of a different kind, one that touches something more immediate, more sensory. What did the dinosaurs actually sound like? Not in the Hollywood sense, not the Jurassic Park roar, which was assembled from a composite of modern animal sounds including tortoise mating calls and whale vocalizations run through various filters, but in the real, biological sense. The answer, frustratingly, is that we may never fully know. Sound does not fossilize. The soft tissues of the vocal apparatus, the larynx, the trachea, the resonating chambers, almost never preserve. We have anatomy. We have ear bones which tell us something about what frequencies animals could hear. We have the hollow crests of hadrosaurs, which we can model acoustically. But the actual sounds that filled Mesozoic air are gone as completely as the air itself. What we can do is reason by analogy. Crocodilians, as the closest living relatives of dinosaurs on the non-avian side, give us one reference point. They produce low-frequency, closed-mouth vocalizations, deep resonant booms and bellows produced by inflating air sacs rather than by moving air across a vocal cord in the way mammals do. The infrasonic components of crocodilian calls travel through both air and water and ground and can be felt as vibrations at considerable distances from the animal. Birds give us the other reference point, and the syrinx, the bird vocal organ, is unique to birds, appearing to have evolved after the KPG extinction. The non-avian dinosaurs did not have a syrinx. Whatever sounds they produced, they were not produced by the same mechanism that generates birdsong. A research paper published in 2016 described the discovery of the oldest known fossilized syrinx, belonging to a duck-like bird called Vegavis yi from Antarctica, dating to approximately 66 to 68 million years ago, right at the end of the Cretaceous. The syrinx was already present in some bird lineages before the impact, suggesting that the vocal complexity of modern birds has deep roots. But it was absent in the non-avian dinosaurs, and absent in most Cretaceous bird lineages. So the soundscape of the Cretaceous was almost certainly dominated by lower frequency sounds than the birdsong-rich world we know today. Deep booms and bellows from the large animals, hisses and closed-mouth resonances from the smaller ones. The thin, high-pitched calls of early birds, a soundtrack more subdued, more basso, more rumbling than the twittering and singing world that emerged from the Paleogene. There is a researcher named Julia Clark at the University of Texas who has spent much of her career thinking about the evolution of bird vocalization, and she has described the post-extinction world as undergoing something like an acoustic revolution. As the syrinx evolved and diversified in the surviving bird lineages, the soundscape of the planet was fundamentally transformed. The world became louder at the high frequencies, more complex, more musical. The morning chorus, in this light, is not just a biological phenomenon, it is a historical one. It is the sound of an acoustic world that was built after the extinction, by the survivors, over 66 million years of vocal evolution. A world of sound that did not exist in the Cretaceous, and that will sound to no one who hears it, like the astonishing product of catastrophe that it actually is. The asteroid did not just end a world, it changed how the world sounds. And now the deepest mystery of all, the one that sits beneath all the others, quietly, never fully asked in polite scientific company. Was there anyone home? Not in the ghost in the machine sense. not asking whether dinosaurs had souls, but asking the simpler and yet almost impossibly difficult scientific question. Was there subjective experience inside a dinosaur's skull? Was there something it was like to be a Triceratops? Did a T-Rex have anything we might recognize as feelings, fear, hunger, satisfaction, the particular animal pleasure of lying in warm sun after a successful hunt? The question of animal consciousness is one of the most contested in all of science and philosophy. Even for living animals, it is extraordinarily difficult to establish what is happening subjectively from the outside. We infer the inner lives of other animals from behavior, from neuroscience, from evolutionary reasoning, but we cannot access those inner lives directly. The philosopher Thomas Nagel's famous question, "What is it like to be a bat?" points at something genuinely unanswerable by any current method. For extinct animals, the problem is compounded. We have no behavior to observe directly, we have fossilized anatomy, and we have everything we can infer from it. We can look at brain endocasts, casts of the interior of dinosaur skulls that preserve the rough shape of the brain and compare them to living animals. We can note that theropod brain-to-body ratios were larger than in other dinosaur groups. We can observe that the regions associated with sensory processing and coordination were well developed. But consciousness, subjective experience, the felt quality of being alive, does not show up in endocasts. It does not leave fossil traces. It is perhaps permanently beyond the reach of paleontology. And yet, I find the question impossible to leave alone. Consider the Maiasaura colony we discussed in Part 3, the hadrosaurs nesting together in structured groups, feeding their young, apparently investing in parental care in ways that go beyond simple instinct. Was there anything inside a Maiasaura parent watching over a nest that we might call attachment? Not love in the human sense. That word carries too much baggage. But something. Some felt pull toward the eggs, toward the chicks, that made the behavior of tending them something more than mechanical. We cannot know. We will never know. But the birds give us a window, however imperfect, into what might have been possible. Because the evidence for rich inner lives in birds, particularly in the corvids and parrots and some other lineages, has become overwhelming enough that the question is no longer whether they have inner lives, but how those inner lives differ from ours. Crows grieve. This is documented. Wild crows respond to the death of a flock member with behaviours that include gathering around the body, reducing activity and, in some observations, appearing to approach and inspect the body with something that looks, behaviourally, like distress. Whether this constitutes grief in the full experiential sense we mean when we use the word of ourselves is unknown, but the behaviour is there. Ravens play. They have been observed sliding repeatedly down snowy slopes for no apparent reason other than the activity itself. Rolling objects, tossing them into the air, catching them, repeating, engaging in what appears to be play in the full sense, activity undertaken for its own reward, with no clear survival benefit, apparently because it is enjoyable. Cockatoos dance to music, not in a trained way, spontaneously, synchronizing their movements to rhythmic beats, with individual variation in style. Snowball, the famous dancing cockatoo who became an internet phenomenon, was studied by researchers who found that he invented at least 14 distinct dance moves on his own, switching between them apparently for variety. These birds are dinosaurs. The experiences, whatever their precise character, are being had by dinosaurs. And if the living birds have inner lives of this richness, it becomes almost irresistible to wonder whether something was already stirring in the Cretaceous ancestors. Whether the T-Rex that paused on the edge of a clearing, head tilted, scenting the air, was doing something more than processing sensory data mechanically. Whether something of what it was like to be a Tyrannosaurus rex is now, impossibly, still available to us in the crows and ravens that stare back at us with those old, considering eyes, we will never know. But the question itself is one of the most beautiful mysteries that science has ever been unable to answer, and it is worth lying in the dark with it tonight. Worth letting it be unanswered, worth letting the not knowing be part of the wonder. I want to close with something that is not exactly a mystery, or rather, it is a mystery of a different kind. Not a puzzle to be solved, but a promise to be kept. Most dinosaurs have not been found yet. This is not a speculation. It is a straightforward consequence of the geology. The rock formations that produce dinosaur fossils cover only a fraction of the Earth's surface, and even within those formations, only a tiny percentage of the rock has been systematically searched. The Badlands of Patagonia alone, one of the most productive dinosaur-producing regions on Earth, extend over an area larger than France, and much of it has never been visited by a paleontologist. The deep-sea sediments, where some Mesozoic life was certainly buried, are almost completely unexplored for vertebrate fossils. The tropical forest regions, where preservation conditions are generally poor and access is difficult, represent enormous unexplored territory. Antarctica, still a forested continent in the Mesozoic, has barely been scratched paleontologically. New techniques are opening new windows. Computed tomography scanning allows researchers to examine fossils in 3 dimensions without destructive preparation, revealing internal structures that would previously have required cutting the specimen apart. Synchrotron radiation allows the visualization of features invisible to ordinary X-rays, including the impressions of soft tissues preserved in fine-grained sediments that standard preparation might destroy. Drone technology and satellite imagery are identifying new, fossil-bearing outcrops in remote regions that would previously have required months of ground survey to locate. Machine learning is being applied to the analysis of museum collections, identifying unrecognized specimens among material that was collected generations ago and has been sitting in drawers ever since. Last year, someone walked across a piece of ground in Argentina and found a bone. A year before that, someone walked across a piece of ground in China and found a bone. A year before that, someone found a bone in Morocco. In each case, that bone led to a species no human had ever seen. A creature that lived and breathed and moved through its world for millions of years, left its remains in the sediment, and waited, in some cases for 100 million years, for the right person to walk across the right piece of ground and look down at the right moment. The most magnificent dinosaur that ever existed may still be in the rock. The most extraordinary feathered creature of the Jurassic. The missing link that would finally resolve the origin of bird flight. The specimen that would tell us, once and for all, what metabolic strategy the sauropods used. The fossil with soft tissue preservation so extraordinary that it would answer questions we haven't yet learned how to ask. All of it is still out there, waiting, patient as stone, and somewhere, tonight, a future paleontologist is a child, lying in the dark, not yet knowing what they will spend their life looking for. The mystery is still unfolding. It always will be. Sleep now. The rocks have kept their secrets for 66 million years. They can keep them a little longer, and tomorrow, somewhere on this planet, someone will find something, and the story will grow. Good night. Where in the world are you watching from? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this.